Hi, everybody. Welcome to the class. This is just going to give us some overview material as you get started. We'll do a couple initial discussions that's going to involve y'all getting able to discuss with each other and talk about where you are coming from, what you're bringing to the class, and things like that, right? Because this is a good chance for y'all to learn. My idea is I want y'all to learn not just from me, but also from each other, right? As resources, as people who know important things, and bring a wide variety of experiences into the classroom. We'll see how well that works in terms of an online class. And at the end of the semester, I'm going to really appreciate your feedback for how I can improve the process for future semesters. For today, go ahead and read over the syllabus. I'm not going to talk about it in this PowerPoint. I'm just going to let you read it. Why spend time doing two things that are just end up being redundant for you? But I do want to, show you my face and let you know who I am, right? Because the thing about learning is a social relationship. We often think of it as something that happens in our brains, like we're these disembodied machines. But you can only ever learn in relationships with other people. And as a teacher, I find that is really a key foundation. So I wanted to let you know a little bit about me, who I am, and what I'm bringing to the course. So my name is Laura June Block. I usually go by June or Professor Block or Dr. Block. Any of those are fine. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I use both of those pronouns, and I tend to like mixing and matching where it's not too much of one or the other. This is my email. That's a great way to get in touch with me. You can also email me through Canvas, and I get that. If you have questions or if you need anything, this is how you reach me. I try to be responsive to student emails pretty quickly. I usually try to get back to you in 24 hours. And if it takes longer than that, feel free to shoot me a follow-up email. I actually appreciate that because, I'm getting dozens and dozens of emails every day. It's totally possible that I just lost your email in the shuffle and missed it. So that's a good mechanism to make sure that I respond to your questions, that I'm there to help you. I have ADHD. Sometimes I miss shit. And so a follow-up, you're never going to upset me. I will always appreciate it. Now, I'm a settler. I am not a Native American person as the professor of this class. And when I say that I am a settler, what I mean is that is my social role relative to Native American peoples in the context of larger of the ways we organize our society on a broad scale. What I'm not saying is that I think settler colonialism is great and we should do more of that. That is exactly not what I'm saying. There's a professor that we'll read later in class that I really like, and one of the things he talks about, his name is Wolf, Patrick Wolf, is he describes himself as a unwilling settler, in that it's not that he wants to dismantle settler colonialism. He thinks it's a bad thing, right? And he wants to actively work. He's organized his entire career around dismantling settler colonialism. However, he still describes himself as a settler because that is his relationship to indigenous peoples here on this place. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to go deeper into this in a few weeks. The idea is that when we talk about settler colonialism, there are two basic pieces, right? The first piece is settler colonialism is a relationship of land dispossession. In common parlance, we often use the phrase land theft, or we'll talk about unceded land. But the technical term for settler colonialism is dispossession, which includes theft, but it includes many other things like treaties that were signed under really coercive conditions, or any number of other things, right? Environmental changes, right? When Europeans came, they introduced a lot of new species, and that had a lot of really devastating environmental impacts. In fact, a lot of indigenous scholars will say that was the beginning of the era of climate change that we've now entered into, or that we now are talking about a lot more. It actually began with colonialism, is the argument. Well, hopefully also have time to come back to that later in the year, or in the semester. And so one thing, right, like let's say that the environment changes, you can no longer secure your own food base and you have to leave, right? That's another form of dispossession. You have to leave your homelands because the environment is devastated. The second piece of settler colonialism is it is a logic of elimination. The thing about dispossessing indigenous peoples of their lands is most of the time they don't like it. They say, no, thank you. So this idea of elimination is the how. Now, current contemporary forms of settler colonialism operate with a subtle difference than this. Or rather, I should say they both do elimination and they do other things at the same time. That it's like settler colonialism with a happy face, essentially. Again, we'll come to that later in the semester. But historically, traditionally, elimination is the mechanism by which the settler colonial state, the settler colonial society, is able to or achieves that dispossession. The most obvious form of elimination is physical genocide. But it can also include forced assimilation or cultural genocide. Now, cultural genocide still does count as genocide under the UN Genocide Convention. We can call it cultural genocide, but it's still a war crime. Or maybe not a war crime. It's still a violation of the Geneva Convention. It is still legally considered genocide. So look at boarding schools, for example, that were built in the 1800s and continued into the 1970s in the United States, as late as the 1990s in Canada. These were places where indigenous peoples were taken from their families as children, right? Children were separated from their parents, and they were taken to these institutions, right, that were essentially about forced assimilation. The motto that one of the creators of these boarding schools said, the way he explained this idea, was kill the Indian, save the man. The idea being, you have to destroy the Indianness of these children so that they can become saved, right? There's a religious aspect to this. Their souls can be saved, and they can join white civilization as it was imagined at this point in time in the late 1800s, around 1880s, primarily. I mean, again, these policies continued, but that was when a lot of these boarding schools were getting built and established. It can also involve kind of more broad, symbolic cultural erasure, right? Like, what do we know about Native American peoples? Usually very little is settlers, unless you're being taught that material from your family. Now, we'll come back to this next week. It's a little more complicated because California is really trying to teach this material to their students. But erasure can also mean just like the erasure of Native American peoples from public consciousness. There's a stereotype in the United States that Native American peoples are part of prehistory, that they existed prior to the United States but don't exist today, that they've all died out or they've gone extinct is often the language used, or they've disappeared in some kind of general abstract euphemism. Now the point, and I'll come back to this with the next slide, is indigenous peoples are still here. So if settler colonialism is a relationship of land dispossession and a logic of elimination, if those are the two pillars of settler colonialism, again, we're going to go deeper into this material in later weeks. Don't worry if you're lost. then my relationship to indigenous peoples is I'm on the settler side of that land dispossession, right? I'm not getting the land dispossessed from me. I'm part of the settler colonial society that's being established. So my positionality is as a settler or an unwilling settler, to follow Patrick Wolf's kind of language. And that's important, right? Because I think y'all should know I'm coming to this class. I'm not a Native American person. I don't want you to think that I am or pretend that I am. I don't want there to be any confusion about it whatsoever. I am deeply committed to this question of decolonization, or what it would mean to dismantle settler colonialism. That is part of my life work as well as Patrick Wolf's life work. But I'm approaching that from the life experience of a settler. You know, I'm also a woman. I'm also trans. I'm also white. Race and indigeneity, they aren't quite identical, right? Like, being white is not totally the same as being a settler. There are many Native American peoples who are light-skinned and look identical to white people, right? Because we're talking about society. We're talking about a world where over the last 400 or 500 years, you know, people make babies. That's what humans do. And so, you know, we often think of like, oh, you got to be one or the other. But the fact of the matter is, to be completely blunt, people fuck. So many Native American folks are very light-skinned. They look like identical to white people. A lot of Native American folks look like black people because they have a lot of African American ancestry. A lot of people have a lot of everything, right? Because again, people travel across the world all the time. Oh, I'm also autistic. I'm neurodivergent, you know, just to contextualize some kind of behaviors you might get from me. And on the syllabus, you might notice this cartoon. I really like this cartoon. I just think it's a little funny, and it does a really good job illustrating the basic premise of this course. And so in this picture, in this comic, right, there are two Native American folks, an elder and a younger person, listening to the radio. And the radio says, non-white babies now outnumber white babies in America for the first time. And the elder says, second. Now, if you remember, if you remember this, and if you don't, I'll just tell you, there was a period not too long ago where there was this big set of news stories that were talking about how white babies would be outnumbered by non-white babies by 2050, based on current birth rates. And this created a lot of cultural anxiety in our society. People were, of course, like on the far right and white supremacist and white nationalist movements, people were, of course, very upset with it. But even more centrist people were, it was a source of social anxiety. Now, I will say the entire controversy, first of all, is rooted in some pretty flawed understandings of race. Racial categories are not static. They change a lot. There's a lot of folks who we consider white today who were not considered white 100, 150, 200 years ago. These things change. And the ideas that we use, the categories of race that we have today are different than we had 100 years ago or 200 years ago. 300 years ago, we didn't really have categories of race, but you'll have to take my my introduction to ethnic studies class to learn about that stuff. But that piece aside, what this comic illustrates so quickly is that once you put indigenous peoples in the frame, the entire conversation, the premises, the assumptions of the entire political debate that was happening about race and infant birth rates is already built on these flawed settler colonial belief systems that are premised on the erasure of indigenous peoples. Because it's not the first time by any stretch of the imagination. Even, as the elder says, second. And it's this little subtle, brief, quick irony of understatement that opens up a world of so much more. And this is what Indigenous studies does on a basic level. Jumping ahead to the next module, you'll see a quote that says, in Native American studies challenges everything that that everything that the United States has to offer, based on everything to offer in terms of education and society, right? That we're challenging everything. We're challenging the basis of everything. And this comic articulates that so beautifully, or so simply. Because once you acknowledge that Native Americans exist today, period, your entire understanding of American history and politics has to change. And that's really what this course is doing. We're saying, hey, what happens if we center Indigenous peoples? And then we work out the implications. How does this change our understanding of history, of society, of education, of the United States? How does this change our larger understanding of what's going on? So let's talk about this place right here. I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement. This is a practice that has become very common. It's pretty universal in Native American studies. It's very common broadly beyond Native American studies on the West Coast. It's becoming more common out east. It's very common in Canada and Australia, which are also settler colonial societies. And here in this place, Cabrillo is built on the unceded territory of the Aptos and Kahastak nations. The Amamutsan tribal band is comprised of descendants of the many peoples from this and surrounding areas who were held in the San Juan Bautista and Santa Cruz missions. They are today working hard to steward this land and honor their ancestors. Now, there's a lot going on here. First of all, right, there's the relationship between pre-mission period peoples and contemporary peoples. What is that relationship? Okay, so when Spaniards arrived and started building the missions, what they found was a world filled with many, 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 many different Native American peoples and nations. They didn't see themselves as belonging to the same group. There was no idea like, oh, we're all Native American here. No, it was like, hey, I'm Aptos. You're Kahastak. Those are different peoples. Maybe we've even been at war with each other for the last couple generations, you know? Maybe we are trading partners. Maybe, any number of things. But they are different nations, similar to how France and Germany are different nations. And this is something that many students don't often realize, but there are over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone. There's even more tribes that do not have that federal recognition status. So we often think in popular culture, in mainstream settler consciousness, that Indigenous peoples or Native Americans are a single group. But it's not a single group. We're talking over 500 federally recognized peoples in the United States alone, and each of those peoples are autonomous, separate nations. Now, when Spaniards arrived, they started building these missions. And in many ways, they had policies and practices that involved, seizing indigenous peoples and forcibly putting them into the mission system. We'll read a lot about this in the upcoming weeks. So all these different nations are part of these missions. And again, these nations would have been in contact with each other, right? They're trading partners, they're wartime enemies, people are intermarrying, right? People move around all the time, all over the place. And in fact, sometimes these villages, these towns, these peoples are moving to different locations anyway, because, if you live in one place too long, you risk overexploiting the environment. And so if you keep moving, you don't have to worry about running out of food as much. So anyway, these nations enter the mission system, right, where they are put in these missions, in this case, in this place right here, the San Juan Bautista and Santa Cruz missions. Again, right, just like I said earlier, The thing about human history is human beings fuck. Not all of them, right? Not every human being, but many of them do. Enough of them do. And so, as they came out of this mission context, right, people started developing new senses of who they were. New family networks, right? New connections, right? New identities. Because now they were the people who came out of this mission. And over time, that identity develops into what today is the Amamutsan people. And specifically, the Amamutsan tribal band, which is a government. It is a government entity of the Amamutsan peoples. That's piece 1. Piece 2. Why do a land acknowledgement? They seem cheesy, right? What am I gonna really undo settler colonialism by acknowledging, hey, we're on this land? There's this great meme, I'll probably share it with y'all on a later slide, right? It shows the meme basically says hey, I just want to acknowledge that we're watching TV on Dave's TV. I stole it from his house, but I'm not going to give it back, but I want to acknowledge that we are watching TV on Dave's stolen TV, right? It's kind of absurd. And a lot of indigenous scholars, including the indigenous scholars who initially created the first land acknowledgements, are looking at this practice and saying, oh no, this has backfired, it's not backfired, but that radical promise they had imagined just never happened because it became a box that people check, a box that settlers check. They do a land acknowledgement and then say, oh good, I'm a good person now. And that's all there is to it. They checked the box. So a lot of indigenous critics will say, hey, you gotta do a little more than checking the box. You need to go deeper into the history of that place you live, which is what we're gonna do over this class, over many weeks. And you gotta figure out, if you are recognizing, if you're acknowledging you're on indigenous land, what are the moral and ethical responsibilities that you have in that role? What kind of action does that call you to? And on a pretty straightforward level, right, going back to those stereotypes of Native American peoples as living in the past, right? Think of images you've seen from cowboy westerns or that Disney Pocahontas movie or all of those kinds of films, right? Magical, mythical, prehistorical. In the face of those stereotypes, a land acknowledgement is about saying, no, indigenous peoples are still here. The people of this place are the Amamutsan. Those are the people who have had their land dispossessed through the mission system, later through the United States. When I say, hey, settler colonialism is a relationship of land dispossession, what I mean is that here at Cabrillo, it's the dispossession of Amamutsan peoples. Those are the people who are institutions as settlers. I'm sorry, I need to really be more careful about when I say are to mean settlers, because not all of you are going to be settlers. Many of you are going to have complicated identities, right? And we can also talk about if your ancestors were brought here in the context of slave ships, does that make you a settler? That's a complicated, we can talk through those kinds of subtlety, those kinds of complexities, right, and nuances. So anyway, I'm going to try to be more careful. I'm sorry because I keep saying in our society when I mean in settler societies, right? Anyway, point being, one way I think about this is that settler colonialism, land dispossession, is the condition of possibility for our societies, right? So that dispossession of Amamutsan people is a condition of possibility that allows for Cabrillo to exist in the way it exists today. It's a condition of possibility for the United States as a legal project and as a social project, right? You cannot have the United States without that stolen land. It couldn't possibly, you wouldn't have, like, it was built on that stolen land. You don't have, it's a condition of possibility. The thing is that relationship of dispossession has to be reproduced every day. Because if we were to give that, if settlers were to give that land back, would the United States be able to exist? Would Cabrillo exist? So that means that it's not just settler colonialism being this thing that happened a long time ago with the mission period. No, it's a way we organize our society today that has to be reproduced every single moment. It has to be reproduced, right? The land has to not be given back for the United States to exist, for Cabrillo to exist the way it does now. That means that relationship of dispossession is also a condition of possibility for the conversation that you and I and your classmates are having today. It is a form of social organization that permeates into every aspect of our lives. So, in the face of that, in the face of all of this stuff, a land acknowledgement, it challenges that logic of elimination, right? It says, oh, no, indigenous peoples existed, and they exist today, and that history matters. And it's a way of acknowledging the dispossession of indigenous land, and in this case, specifically the dispossession of Amamutsan land, as a condition of possibility that organizes our lives and our institutions that has to be reproduced every single day. We have to keep that dispossession going in order to reproduce the colonial world that we live in. I hope it's clear. I'm not saying that we have to in the sense that morally we're obligated to. I think it's morally fucked up, right? But the point is, this is an everyday kind of, that this system needs to be reproduced every single day. So we're really focusing in on people living today. Now there's another piece here. Last piece, piece number 3. You may notice, maybe you've heard a land acknowledgement that was different from your other Cabrillo instructors. Maybe you've seen the official Cabrillo land acknowledgement, and you're like, wait a minute, June, that's not what the official acknowledgement says. The official acknowledgement says that we were on the unceded territory of Upi peoples, not Aptos and Kastak. What's up? Cabrillo got it wrong. My understanding is that essentially what happened is that Cabrillo copied the land acknowledgement of UC Santa Cruz. Now, UC Santa Cruz is in a different place than Cabrillo. It is physically in a different location. And UC Santa Cruz is on Upi land. Cabrillo, though, is not. Cabrillo is on Aptos land for the Aptos campus and Kastak land for the Watsonville campus. Now, it's clear to me that, I'll just say that faculty are working really hard to try to get the administration to correct the land acknowledgement, to make it right. But that is not, there's institutional bureaucratic barriers. We're kind of just trying to make it happen, and it's kind of stuck in the wheels of state bureaucracy right now. And what's really clear to me from this is that the Cabrillo land acknowledgement, the Cabrillo land acknowledgement really does a good job jumping through certain hoops of indigenous critiques of bad ways of doing land acknowledgements, right? We're focusing on contemporary peoples, things like that. But what it has not involved was talking to Amamutsan people and historians and working with them and building relationships and saying, even just, hey, did we get this right? So in order to make a land acknowledgement in a better way, there's a challenge here, right? Because it's going to take labor to make a better land acknowledgement. You need to be able to do the historical research, right? We need to go back to the historical documents. I have written this one based on a couple maps that I'll show you next week. But I have not done that deep research to really understand what this means in this place. What was going on in this location? Where is Aptos territory beyond this kind of maps? How did the people who made the maps, how did they come to the conclusion that Aptos territory was here and not over there? 2, it requires the labor of working with living indigenous peoples to actively challenge settler colonialism as a social principle of organization, a way we organize our society. Now again, if you don't get all the little technical details I've thrown out at you and you're feeling overwhelmed and confused, don't worry about it. We're going to come back to all these technical definitions later. Now shifting away from that content level things and thinking about land and those basic foundations of what we're doing in this class, I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about how I grade. The idea is essentially, this is my rubric. I've just screenshotted it from the syllabus. And the way I think about these kinds of things, right, is you get a grade from A to F. I actually don't believe in grades. I'll tell you that up front. I think grades are counterproductive. I think they train students to focus on the number that they are assigned and to think of themselves as their value and their intelligence as being reflected by this number or this letter, in which they become interchangeable with everyone else. And I just think that as a result, right, students end up learning to focus not on the learning content or what they've learned, but rather what their grade's going to be. And I think the fact that students tend to focus on what the grade is going to be in that number is an adaptive response to the institutional system that we've created, because you have identified that indeed that is what matters in the larger structure. Now, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a bait and switch, because your grades don't actually matter once you leave college, with the exception of applying to grad schools. Nobody cares after you graduate if you had a 4.0 or a 3.0 or what. It just doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you learned. So I think that's a bit of a disservice. However, I am an employee of the state. And it means not only do I have all of my own personal ideals, but I also am a petty bureaucrat. And I have to give you a grade, because otherwise the dean is going to come after me. So what I do is I tell you how I'm going to calculate that grade. Now, a C is a passing grade. Anything above that is passing. Anything below that is failing. And the idea for a C, that's how I think of the base. That's how I'm thinking of the baseline, right? Is essentially you're doing the work. You're completing the readings. You're completing the lectures. You're submitting your notes to demonstrate to me that you have in fact completed that. And you're doing all of the basic credit discussion forms. I'm going to talk in the next slide about the difference between basic and advanced credit discussion forms, but every module there's going to be 2 discussion forms. If you complete the basic credit discussion form, you're going to get a passing grade. That's a C. Now, this is also going to include what you turn in for assignments. And so your assignments need to be completed, of course. And they demonstrate an adequate understanding of the material. Maybe there's pieces you didn't get. Maybe there's chunks of things that you misunderstood or points that you missed. But you get you've done the work and you're getting it. You're doing all right. And if, a C for me, what that tells me, if I'm giving you a C, it's not necessarily a bad grade. I mean, it's a passing grade. It's adequate, which maybe sounds harsher than I mean it to. But the idea is that, I'm communicating to you that there is something that you're kind of missing. And what that tells you is, oh, hey, I should figure out what I'm missing. Maybe I should go talk to Dr. Block and ask her, what I can do, things like that. What I need to understand more deeply, It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means, hey, let's have a conversation about the pieces you're missing. A D means that there are larger pieces that you are missing, or alternatively, that you're not completing those basic credit discussions consistently. Or maybe you are completing them, but your engagement with your other students on those discussion forums, your replies to your peers, are not particularly thoughtful and only very limited. Again, no moral judgment. No, this is not a statement about your worth as a person or your intelligence. If you receive a D on an assignment, that just means, hey, you misunderstood something. Come to me and I'll help you understand what that is. And F means there's something essential, the foundations of the course that you're missing in that work. Or you might be, I will sometimes very occasionally give Fs for students who refuse to build with those basic foundations. For example, if you are not engaging with what Indigenous studies is and calls for as a field, I cannot pass you in a class that is in ethnic studies. Alternatively, disruptive and disrespectful behavior can also result in an F grade. That includes things like racism, transphobia, sexism, etc., right? I'm not asking for perfection here. Now, I want to be clear about that. You can make mistakes, and we can talk, and we can learn. But you have to learn from those mistakes. And ultimately, those kinds of behaviors will result in a failing grade if you're not learning from them and showing improvement by the end of the semester. So that's the C and below range. The B, alternatively, right, you're doing the basic credit work. There's a basic credit discussion forms. And your responses to your peers, to other students in the class on those forms is thoughtful. You completed many or some of the advanced credit discussions. And your written work demonstrates a strong grasp of the material and the underlying issues. If you receive a B on your written work or your assignments, what that communicates is that you got it. I'm really happy with a B. And A involves taking the conversation further in some way, right? So a B is like, you got it, and A is you're taking our conversations further. It means you're completing both the basic and the advanced credit discussions on a consistent basis. And you're responding to your classmates' posts with thoughtful replies. That's the basic rubric I'm going to be using. Now, when it comes to individual assignments, I will share with you when I outline those assignments the rubric that I'm going to use for evaluating that specific assignment with a bit more detail. But this is the general idea for the class as a whole. I do want to talk a little bit about how I'm going to calculate your discussion grades because I'm going to use a little bit of a different system that you may not have encountered in the past. Essentially, each module, there will be readings, there will usually be a lecture, and then there will be 2 separate discussion forums for you to contribute to. The first one is going to be a basic credit discussion forum. That's just the language I'm using. And the second type will be the advanced credit discussion forums. The idea is that if you complete the basic credit discussion forum, you receive a passing grade for the module, combined with the completion, or at least for the discussion, right? So the module grade as a whole is going to involve your completion of the readings and lecture, which I will evaluate when you submit your notes, and then your contribution to these discussion forums. And so if you go through the material, you read, you watch the lecture, you take notes, and you contribute to the basic credit discussion forum, you will receive a passing grade for that module, which is going to be a C grade. The second discussion forum, what I'm calling the advanced credit discussion forum, is the questions will usually be a little more, a little deeper intellectually, a little more conceptual perhaps. And if you contribute to the advanced discussion forums, then you receive a A grade for that module, combined, of course, with completion of the readings and lecture. My idea here, the idea of doing things this way, is I'm trying to give students a high degree of autonomy. Essentially, I don't know what's going on in your lives. I know things are busy. I know many of you work. I know you might be dealing with health issues or emergency issues or medical things, or family emergencies come up, all kinds of things that I don't know about and I don't necessarily even need to know about unless you want to tell me. So what this does is it gives you the autonomy to evaluate to take ownership of what you want to accomplish in this course and what grade you want to get. So if you're happy just to do the minimum and pass, just make sure you complete all the modules and do all the basic credit discussion forums. If you want to go deeper into this material, if you want to learn this material more and talk through it on a deeper level, or write through it on a deeper level, then you can also do the advanced credit discussion forums. And I'm just going to basically calculate all the numbers at the end of the semester, in which essentially, right, so if you do half of the advanced discussion forums, but you do all of the readings and you do all of the lectures and you do all of the basic credit forums, that would average out, right, to a B. You've done half of the advanced stuff. And so that's essentially what I'm going to be doing. Now, this is just the participation and completion of course material aspect of your grades, because of course if you look in the syllabus, you see that I'm also going to be grading you on projects, papers, and two short papers and a final project. Now, I might change the structure of the writing assignment from semester to semester, so I'll always check with what the assignment description says on Canvas when I create that, as well as what the syllabus says. And if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. Now, the last piece that I want to hit on here when talking about discussion grades is that I'm looking for a good faith effort, right? You will have to do for each of these discussion forums 3 things. You need to make a post yourself, and then you need to make 2 replies to posts that your classmates made. Those 3 things in combination amount to a completion of the assignment. Now, I will be looking to make sure that you have, that you're making good faith both posts and replies. And I reserve the right to either count that grade as incomplete if for example, the replies that you're making are, just really brief, like a couple words, and that's consistent. And I'm not going to accept that. I want a more thoughtful reply. Now, in terms of, and for the advanced credit, right, I'm going to be evaluating the same thing. And I also reserve the right to dock points for if students are making replies that are just about getting that credit, but they're not thoughtful replies, I'm not going to count that. So I might dock you down to a B for that module. So that's essentially what I'm going to be doing, and that's how I'm going to evaluate your discussion and calculate your discussion grades. Remember, I'm looking for good faith, and I'm looking for thoughtful replies with your peers. If you're doing those things, I'm going to be really happy. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go super deep into the syllabus. You can read that on your own, and I'm not going to repeat most of the rest of the information. I'll just kind of give you a quick run through of okay, so catalog description. It surveys, that's what this course is about. The instructor-specific description that shares how I'm going to approach this particular subject matter myself. Course objectives that communicates what you're going to learn by the end. I outline all the different aspects of your grade, what contributes to your final grade, how I'm going to math the numbers out at the end of the semester, and a little brief description of all of those pieces. Keep in mind that written work should be double-spaced, 12-point font, 1-inch margins, using a professional-looking font like Times New Roman, Arial, Cambria, Calibri, Garamond are all good. Don't try to fuck around with the margins because I have hundreds of papers that I'm grading. I see the difference when the margins move to different places. It's really obvious to your professors. It's not subtle. It's not tricky. It's not a smart way to cheat. Now, the double-spaced and font issues, that's not going to matter for the discussion forums because, you're just going to post on the forum. You don't get to choose your font and double spacing and things like that. So don't worry about that for the discussion forums. With your papers, I'm going to be assigning first drafts and final drafts. The idea there is you are going to first submit the first draft. The first draft is not supposed to be good. It's just supposed to exist. Good writers do not write good first drafts. Good writers edit their first drafts to make their final drafts good. And so that's the practice you're going to be working on. That's the writing practice that I want you all to be doing. So you'll turn in the first draft, and then after that, there will be a second submission, which will be the final draft. And part of what I'm going to have you do in this class is I'm going to have you cut down your first drafts. Because the more you cut, the more you are just left with the most profound, smartest pieces. I have taken student papers that were mediocre and cut them down and just removed the parts that were mediocre. And the result was a very strong paper that they were able to publish in a professional setting. So that cutting and editing process really is essential. At the end of the semester, you'll have a research paper to do. There'll be more information about assignments before they're due, and I'll describe them in Canvas with more depth. Inclusion, inclusion is really important at Cabrillo and also to me. I'm not going to be able to tolerate bigotry in this class because I have to create a classroom environment in which students from all kinds of backgrounds can join in. And so if I were to tolerate environment of bigotry, then that would make this classroom space less open to diverse students. And I can't do that. That is, first of all, not legal. And second of all, not the kind of environment I want to create. Now that said, feel free to correct me if I ever mispronounce your name or say something problematic. I take those as learning moments. We all make mistakes. We're all imperfect human beings. So, I'm open to that kind of thing, and I like hearing that because I like learning. Now, some of the content in the class will be very triggering. If you have a PTSD response, I recommend taking care of yourself first and regulating your emotions and regulating your body, and then resuming the content. The reason for that is because when you go into a trigger response, when you have a PTSD response, what that means is that your frontal cortex of your brain is shutting down, and you enter into a fight or flight response. Now, your frontal cortex is the part of your brain responsible for abstract thought and higher order reasoning, which are the exact things we're trying to cultivate in a college-level class. So sometimes it's easier or better to bring your body to a more regulated state to let those emotions pass through you and then come back and try to learn the material rather than pushing your brain to do something that it physiologically cannot do very well. Now, this is different, right? There's a trigger, and that's different than students who might just feel uncomfortable in a more general way. If you feel uncomfortable, for example, because we're talking about something like genocide, which we will talk a lot about in this class, or different genocidal policies. My advice in those cases are to lean into the discomfort. Try to figure out what's coming up for you. What are you feeling on an emotional level? And where is that coming from? What ideas are you bringing to the conversation? What judgments are you making? And really interrogate your own emotional and intellectual process. What assumptions are you bringing to the table, and where did you get those? So the idea there, right, is you're leaning in and you're reflecting on your own emotional process. And the reason for that is because if you don't take your own emotional process seriously, and you don't think through that in a kind of reflective and critical way, you're going to end up projecting those emotions into the class in ways in which we're not really talking about the content or the subject matter. We're talking about your feelings. And, I'm not going to say facts don't care about your feelings. I mean, I guess facts aren't sentient, so they don't care about much at all. But the idea, right, is like, yeah, we should be, working to separate those kinds of things. And, often it's those kinds of emotional responses to like the word genocide or something else that people don't realize at first is an emotional response because they jump to judgment. So I'm trying to get you to reflect on your own emotional process so that you can then approach the subject matter in a way that is less clouded by those negative emotions. Now, at minimum, right, the expectation for this class is you are required to do the work and understand the arguments that I make in lecture, to understand other people's perspective in the discussion forums, and understand the arguments made in the readings that I assign. This is a college-level class. You've got to understand the material. That's the baseline, right? Now, you can disagree with any of it. You can think I'm full of shit. You can think the readings are full of shit. That's fine, I disagree with a lot of the readings, but I think they put forward interesting ideas. The idea here, right, is you have to engage. You have to make a good faith engagement with the course material. You have to be working to understand. You are not required to agree with it. You're not required to agree with me. All you need is to understand. And I will also say, right, going back to that discomfort that some students may experience, the point is never, ever that you or anyone else is a good or bad individual. I'm a professor. I don't care. It's not my job for you to be a good person. It's not my job to evaluate that. What I try to do in my classes, right, is that we are looking at history and literature. We're looking at the humanities and social sciences. And from that perspective, the goal is to understand larger social systems. So it's never about, are you a good or bad person? It's how do we understand settler colonialism and indigenous movements as social systems? Now, I will forget that people take this stuff personally because I'm autistic. But I promise you, it's never about you as an individual, and that's always good to remind yourself. If you're starting to take it personally, remind yourself, it's not really about you. It's not about you being good or bad, or right or wrong. It's about understanding larger social systems. I have some information in here about communication, how to write a professional-looking email. That's good information. I only learned that because I was corrected by my professors and it was embarrassing, so I just teach students in the syllabus. Read that. It's good advice. It's good to keep in mind, and it'll make people if you can write emails in this way, people outside of college will take you more seriously. It's kind of fucked up, but they will. You'll see information on the syllabus about penalties for late assignments and extensions, academic integrity and plagiarism. I have a whole framework about how to use AI in a good way, in a critical way, because I'll tell you what, AI makes a lot of mistakes. And so you can look through that on your own time, but ultimately you are not allowed to use AI to draft assignments for you, to do work like summarize readings or integrate readings into a paper that you haven't read yourself, or that you have read yourself. You can't use AI to edit the content of the assignments, although you can use AI to give you editorial suggestions that you can choose to implicate or not and choose how to implicate. And you cannot use AI for any tasks that I've listed as acceptable but proceed with caution unless you are proceeding with caution and doing that in the way outlined in the parenthetical remarks. Now that said, many people use AI in professional settings in really effective ways. I think there's a lot of great stuff that AI can do that can really help you learn, but it can't do your thinking for you. There's information about student support, accessibility. If you have accommodations, shoot me that paperwork. Title IX, I'm a required reporter. That means that if you bring up something in the discussion forum or with me personally that relates to an event of sexual harassment or sexual violence or domestic or dating violence, then I am required to report it to our Title IX coordinator. What she then does is she creates a report documenting what happened, and she will reach out to the victim in that situation and ask them, present support, present materials that could be supportive, such as therapeutic resources and legal resources. Now, you are not required to respond to the Title IX coordinator's email. And you can ignore it. That is your autonomy. That's your decision to make. If you just want to move past everything and not think about it anymore, you can. And every Title IX coordinator will tell you can do that, and they will respect your decision. Now, if you want to talk about this stuff with somebody who doesn't have to report it, who can maintain confidentiality, that's going to be a counselor, a nurse, or a chaplain. And if you want help finding them, I'm happy to help find them. Lastly, required books. You can get these books online through the library as ebooks, or you can buy them through the through the bookstore. And that's pretty much it for the syllabus. Your assignments are going to be in the module section. Each module will explain what you're doing. Again, there will be a set of readings, a lecture, and 2 discussion forums, the basic and the advanced credit forms. I will also upload my slides if you like to use those from my PowerPoints, so you'll have access to all of that as well. And okay, with that, that's what the course is going to look like. I'm glad to have y'all here. Welcome. There's 2 discussion forums for today, or for this module, I'm sorry. And, congratulations on completing this part.